This is Essay 29, Indigenous People. In 1934, Congress passed and Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, signed into law the Indian Reorganization Act. This was a New Deal policy which gave Native Americans more power to self-govern themselves. And it ended the previous era's policy of allotting tribal lands to individual families. FDR had also began the closure of Indian boarding schools. Additionally, surplus of lands on reservations were returned to tribal ownership if they were not previously acquired by another city. This brought more prosperity and economic growth for tribes that had never been seen in that were seen in previous generations, and it paved the way for tribes to expand their political power. However, in 1953, the U.S. government had relapsed into assimilation. The government felt that it would be better for Native Americans if they had assimilated as individuals into mainstream U.S. society as a result of the termination of the Native American special status, and their main method of termination was through relocation. In the 50s and 60s, they created relocation programs which encouraged Native Americans to leave their reservations and pursue economic opportunities and live in urbanized areas. However, these opportunities were not as plentiful as promised. Native Americans ended up being in severe unemployment and poverty. The self-determination era is characterized by an explosion in civil rights activism. Poverty, unemployment, poor housing, and education were an embarrassment to the U.S. Half of the Native American population lived on reserves, where unemployment had ranged from 20 to 80%, and the life expectancy in 1968 was only 44 years. Starting in the late 1960s, the self-determination era had ushered a new wave of tribal leadership. Activists across the country had used political, legal, and civil tactics to force the U.S. to reckon with its history of the mistreatment of Native Americans. In 1969, a coalition of Native American students had begun an 18-month-long occupation of Alcatraz Island, which is a notorious former prison on an island also known as the Rock. The occupiers' main point of this was to barren the Rock as a suitable place to become an Indian reservation. However, the group had only brought national media attention to the issues and concerns of Native Americans. This was an effective way to gain publicity. In 1973, the American Indian Movement, also known as AIM, was a group within the Red Power movement, which was inspired by the Black Power movement. And they brought about an armed confederation with federal government officials at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee Reservation was occupied in order to publicize the reservation's problem. AIM members, some of them which were armed, took 11 residents on the settlement hostage. From these shootouts, 2 Native Americans were killed and 1 federal agent was permanently paralyzed. This occupation and subsequent shootouts had began between the armed protesters and federal agents, which created big media coverage. Native Americans had gained strong national attention, media coverage, and celebrity endorsements pertaining to the issues concerning Native Americans. This had also led to a large number of Native Americans getting involved into civil rights and tribal affairs. Many laws were passed in response to the Red Power movement. The most notable was the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975, which had restored the special legal status of Native American tribes. Tribes were allowed to self-govern and were given back their reservations, and they were provided with funding by the government as long as they followed certain guidelines. When Congress had passed Nixon's Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975, it had gave the most of the powers exercised by states' governments and had increased control over education. The amount of progress Native Americans had made between the 60s and 80s during the Civil Rights Movement in the U.S. is still debated by historians today. Some historians argue that Native Americans made very significant progress. These historians argue that the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 was a big advancement in self-government. They also point out that the land was restored to numbers of tribes. Additionally, Native American culture was legally recognized and it was preserved. And moreover, gambling casinos on reservation lands were earning tribes over $1 billion. Over $1 billion annually in the 90s. However, other historians see a much more modest progress. These historians acknowledge that the legal progress had been achieved by Native Americans in the U.S., but the real problems of poverty that Native Americans had faced was not addressed in any clear way. By the end of the 20th century, Native Americans had greater pride in their ethnicity, autonomy, and protection from the federal government. Their lives had improved since 1945. However, their income had improved only by a third during the 90s, and it was still only half of the national average. Native American disease, poverty, and unemployment rates had remained the highest out of all ethnic groups. Native Americans had been in Canada since time immemorial. The French and British explored, colonized, and fought over various places within North America in the late 1400s. These areas still constitute present-day Canada. Canada's colonial history regularly featured Indigenous groups ceding or giving up their traditional territories to European settlers through treaties. With colonization and settlement, traditional Native American culture was forever altered. Canada was created in 1867 and became a wholly independent country in 1882. After Canadian independence, the Indian Act in 1876 had consolidated all existing legislations relating to Native Americans and into one place under the jurisdiction of the Canadian federal government. The Act created the Department of Indian Affairs in 1880 to administer the Act, and it remains active today. The Indian Act implemented many of regulations, controls, and limits on Native Americans that had designed to erase their way of life. The Act had created Indian agents who had administered the rules and constantly monitored reserve communities. The Indian Act restricted core indigenous cultural practices, such as the potlatch. The potlatch is a system of gift-giving with political, religious, kinship, and economic implications. Potlatches also involve music, dancing, singing, storytelling, and making speeches, and often joking and games. The honoring of the supernatural and the recitation of oral histories are essential part of many potlatches that were banned. The post-1945 U.S. policy had shifted from assimilation to self-government, while the Canadian system remained deeply rooted in assimilation. For example, Canadian residential schools were much larger and a more permanent project. They had continued for half a century after counterpart schools in the U.S. had begun to close in 1933 under FDR's order. A total of 130 Indian boarding schools had operated between 1831 and 1966 in Canada. Over 1,500 Native American children were forced to attend residential schools during this period. These schools had rampant abuse and neglect. An estimated 6,000 children died at Canadian residential schools. Native American parents protested and resisted against residential schools throughout their operation over 100 years. However, the last Indian boarding school had only recently closed in 1966. Native Americans in Canada had organized civil rights groups, but they did not reach the publicity or the legislative success of their U.S. counterparts. Ultimately, the Canadian government had failed to learn from the U.S. experience. The 1969 White Paper had caused considerable controversy in Canada. This was a Canadian government proposal aimed to assimilate all Indian people under the Canadian state, without consulting any Native American. Surprised by an outraged reaction, the government had dropped the White Paper, but had ignored the demands for self-government. Native people in Canada did not gain the right to self-government and land rights like in the U.S. Reservations remained in possession of and administered by the federal government in Canada. The federal government had continued to determine which person is a Native American rather than the individual tribes. Until the late 90s, Canadians rarely acknowledged that the federal government in control of nearly every facet of Native American existence, including the right to define oneself as a Native American and as a form of oppression. Post-1945, the Canadian government had also remained negligent in terms of water quality, overcrowded housing, and substandard health care services. While the Native population had continued to grow, it was still the worst off of all Canadians. In the 90s, the Canadian Supreme Court gave more land to reserves. National Aboriginal Day was first celebrated in 1996. In 2008, the Prime Minister had apologized for the sinister residential school system that had existed for more than a century. These symbolic gestures were very large steps, but they weren't necessarily substantial change. From the first arrival of Europeans in Canada, the great issue with the natives was autonomy and the use of land. This has remained a focal point of contention by the year 2000.